Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome. Just giving another minute to see if more people come in. But it looks like it's a pretty good turnout tonight. For all of you on the East Coast, I hope you're staying safe and you've stocked up on supplies. Sounds like we've got a big ice storm coming in. So hope you're safe and well in these difficult times. And for everybody else who's not here, I hope you're well too. And maybe being glad not to have the ice storm come through. So I think we can start with the event for tonight. I'd like to begin by welcoming everybody to our event. This is now the second year of the Catherine Kerr Memorial Series in Vital Energy in Health and Healing, and the first event of 2022. So this lecture series was founded in memory of Dr. Catherine Kerr, who was a researcher here at Brown, who is very interested in the potential of vital energy, particularly as is expressed through different sort of mind-body techniques like Tai Chi and Qigong and meditation for providing health and healing and well-being for everyone around the world. And so her research was foundational and was very inspiring. Unfortunately, she passed away in 2016, and this lecture series is an attempt to kind of carry on her spirit and that vision she had of a future that we could get to through studying these techniques. And the series has been inviting different experts from a wide range of fields and backgrounds, whether they are researchers in the sciences or scholars in the humanities and anthropology and history, as well as practitioners of these traditional technologies themselves, to give us a fully rounded perspective of how to approach these different mind-body techniques and how to research them and how to understand them. And so in the spirit of that, tonight, for our first guest of 2022, I'd like to invite Dr. Julienne Bauer. Now, Dr. Julienne Bauer is a professor of psychology and psychiatry biobehavioral sciences at the University of California, Los Angeles. Her research focuses broadly on bidirectional interactions between psychological behavioral states and immune function among individuals facing stressful life events, including cancer patients and survivors. She's particularly interested in positive psychological states, including positive affect and eudaimonic well-being, and strategies for building resilience in the neuroimmune network. Dr. Brown's interest in psychology began as an undergraduate here at Brown University, where she worked in the library of Dr. J. Michael Walker. Currently, Dr. Bauer is Associate Director of the Cousins Center for Psychoimmunology and the Mindful Awareness Research Center, and a member of the Johnson Comprehensive Cancer Center at UCLA. She's received career awards from the Psychoneuroimmunological Research Society and the American Psychological Association, and was awarded the inaugural George F. Solomon Professorship of Psychobiology Term Chair at UCLA. Her research is funded by the National Institutes of Health and the Breast Cancer Research Foundation. And so it's my great honor to welcome back Dr. Julienne Bauer to speak with us here virtually at Brown tonight.
Great. Thanks so much. Delighted to be here. I was wishing that I was on campus, but actually maybe not if an ice storm is coming. We've got beautiful sunny skies outside in LA. So really delighted to be here. And as you mentioned, my journey as a scientist really came from studying neuroscience at Brown. I did the classic Brown undergrad thing of shopping around for different classes and stumbled into a neuroscience class and was just completely fascinated by it, which stimulated my interest in psychoneuroimmunology, which is totally a mouthful. So thank you for getting through all of those Psychoneuroimmunology Research Society. That's that one. Okay, let me go ahead and pull up my slides here. And we'll get this on viewer. How's that looking? Is that working? Great. Okay. So I'm going to be talking about work that we've been conducting on mind-body interventions and their effects on mental and physical health, and really trying to answer this question of whether and how we can use mind-body therapies to reduce stress and promote well-being. So we should start with some kind of statements about stress and disease. And this is one of these funny things that everyone thinks they know, that stress affects health, but really it's been decades of research to try to demonstrate this in a very valid and reliable way. But at this point, we have very compelling evidence that psychological stressors can impact the onset and progression of a variety of different diseases, including depression, cardiovascular disease, viral and autoimmune diseases, and even diseases like cancer, although I will say the evidence for cancer is not as strong as for some of these other conditions. And let me just show you, I love data. Let me show you a little bit of data to support this assertion. So this is data from a really seminal study by Sheldon Cohen, who's at Carnegie Mellon University. They use a really interesting paradigm to look at the association between stress and viral illness. So they bring people into the lab, they ask them about stressors they may have experienced, and then they inoculate everyone with the cold virus. So everyone gets exposed to the virus, but not everyone gets sick. And what they find is that the people who report higher levels of psychological stress are the ones who are more likely to get colds after viral infection. And so you can see people who are at the kind of 3 to 4 level of psychological stressors, they've got maybe a 28% chance of getting a cold, versus those with 11 to 12 stressors, they're almost at 50% risk of developing a cold. We can see very similar trends when we look at the association between stress and depression. So this is work by Connie Hammond at UCLA, and she's looking at the association between both acute stressors in the solid line and chronic stressors in the dotted line, and looking to see whether those are associated with the probability of developing a major depressive episode, or MDE. And you can see that higher levels of both acute and chronic stress stress is the strongest risk factor for the onset of depression. And that's illustrated, I think, really clearly here. So how does this happen? We and others are really interested in the immune system as a critical pathway that links stress and both mental and physical health. So, and we can think about this in the context of historical physical threats, things like attack by a saber-toothed tiger, an unfriendly neighbor, etc. These stressors, they elicit a particular type of immune response. They usually increase inflammation, which is important because inflammation is responsible for dealing with infection and tissue damage. They also decrease antiviral immunity. When you're about to be attacked by one of these saber-toothed tigers, you're usually not needing all of your antiviral defenses on board. What you really need is something that's going to help protect you against infection or, again, tissue damage. So in the short term, this immune response profile is very healthy. It enhances wound healing, and it leads to a greater likelihood of survival. Let's fast forward in time though. So what are the stressors that we experience now? In this particular picture, they're focusing on social threats, including loneliness, bullying, aggression. These stressors, the immune system experience these in the same way as these historical stressors that were threatening our physical health. So you get an increase in inflammation and a decrease in antiviral immunity. And again, fine in the short term, but these usually are not short-term stressors. These usually are long-term stressors. And that's where you start to see the problem, because you do not really want to be living in a constant state of upregulated inflammation and downregulated antiviral immunity. So I could give a whole talk on antiviral immunity, super interesting and important in the context of COVID. But let's focus for the purposes of today on inflammation. We have learned over the past, I'd say, 2 decades about the central role of inflammation in almost all of the major chronic illnesses we experience. So that includes depression, cancer, cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's, pulmonary diseases, arthritis, autoimmune disease. You name it, they're discovering that inflammation is playing a critical role. So inflammation seems to be central to a lot of our modern illnesses. So the question our group is really interested in is, can mind-body therapies help? And kind of illustrating that in this graphic, where we're wondering whether mind-body approaches, including meditation, qigong and tai chi and yoga, might influence the dynamic interactions between the brain, between the stress response systems, including the sympathetic nervous system and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis that releases cortisol. These stress hormones have profound effects on immune cells. So here's a little immune cell. It's bathing in the stress hormones that it's receiving from these 2 different stress response systems. And that's influencing what genes get expressed and ultimately what proteins get made by that cell. Here, what we're showing is that stress can activate inflammatory pathways, leading to production of these little pro-inflammatory cytokines that are what are driving this chronic inflammation. So we're wondering here whether mind-body therapies can interrupt some of these processes. So what are mind-body therapies? You addressed this in the introduction. These have been defined as a group of therapies that emphasize the use of the brain in conjunction with the body to assist the healing process. The ones I'm going to focus on today are yoga, tai chi, and mindfulness meditation. And I think it's useful to contrast these with traditional psychotherapies, which focus on the brain, like cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, and also with physical therapies like exercise, which really focus on the body. So, there's differences between these different approaches in terms of the extent to which they're focusing on the mind and the body, but there is an idea of integration in these approaches in a way that there hasn't historically been with these other therapies. Okay, so what are the pathways through which these mind-body therapies could influence immunity and health? Well, one possibility is they can decrease stress, and that might influence activity in these stress response systems, production of these pro-inflammatory cytokines. And as I said, there's a lot of evidence that stress is bad for disease. So that's one mechanism. One of the exciting things, though, I think about mind-body approaches is that they also have the potential to increase well-being. So you heard in the introduction that I'm really interested in positive psychological states and how they can be health enhancing. And there's really been a revolution in psychology in the last, again, decade or two, where we have this whole new field of positive psychology. People have started to focus and study positive psychological states like happiness, well-being, meaning and purpose in life, kindness, feelings of social connection and engagement. And we're very interested in how these positive psychological states may also have relevance for physical and mental health. So I'll be talking about both of those today. Okay, and then the last frame I'll give for the talk before kind of moving into talking about the studies that we've been conducting is a focus on cancer survivors. So really all of the work I'm going to be presenting today is work that's been conducted in the context of cancer survivorship. So why cancer survivors? There's a lot of people who are cancer survivors with advances in diagnosis and treatment. There's a growing number of cancer survivors in the United States. In 2022, there's estimated to be 18 million cancer survivors. And the vast majority of these survivors are living long lives. So 70% of them at this point are living more than 5 years post-diagnosis. So this is a large population of individuals. And although for many of these folks, their cancer is cured, right? But the cancer doesn't necessarily end because cancer can lead to a host of side effects. The most prominent of these are behavioral symptoms, including depression, including fatigue. and including sleep disturbance. So great that you've gotten through your cancer diagnosis and treatment, but unfortunately for many people, these side effects can linger for months and many years after treatment completion. Cancer survivors are also at risk for cardiovascular disease and other chronic health conditions that are driven by inflammation. So we've been really interested in understanding whether mind-body approaches are helpful for these individuals. So what I'm going to do now is kind of take you through some of the work that we've done looking at different mind-body therapies. And let's start with yoga. So I first became interested in yoga when I was doing research with breast cancer survivors who were experiencing fatigue. And we were learning a lot about the role of the immune system in cancer-related fatigue. We were learning about the role of psychological factors. And I was taking yoga at this time, and I was chatting with my yoga instructor one day. And she said, Julie, you work with cancer survivors. I'd really love to, I think yoga could be really helpful for them. Can you, what do you think? Can we get together and do something? And I was like, well, I don't know. I mean, I work with these women who have really severe, persistent fatigue. And her eyes just lit up. She was like, those are my people. Like, I can help them. I can help these women. So we launched a program of research looking at yoga. So what is yoga? Yoga means to yoke or to join together. It traditionally refers to the union of the individual with the universal self. There are many different styles of yoga: Iyengar, Kundalini, Ashtanga, Bikram. There's find the yoga studio nearest you. They offer lots of these. Core components most include postures or asanas, breathing or pranayama, and meditation. Now, most of the studies with cancer patients and survivors use what they call hatha yoga, which is a broad term to describe yoga that typically focuses on physical postures. So I want to make sure I'm really clear about the kind of yoga that we're talking about here. So I think sometimes when you say yoga, this is what comes to mind, right? People who are doing really aggressive types of yoga. But really, this is the kind of yoga that we're talking about in the studies that we've been conducting. And I'll take you through that in a little more detail. So as I said, we were really interested in the possibility that yoga would be effective for cancer-related fatigue. So in this study, we targeted those women. We recruited women who were on average 2.5 years post-diagnosis. So again, these were women who've been living with fatigue for many years. We had one participant who was 22 years post-diagnosis and was still experiencing cancer-related fatigue. So these women were randomized to either the yoga condition or a health education control condition. And each of them was a 12-week intervention. The yoga intervention was based on Iyengar yoga. Here's BKS Iyengar, the leader of this particular approach. And the Iyengar tradition is interesting because they really believe in the power of poses, and they believe in the power of specific poses for specific conditions. So the yoga instructor in this trial went to India and talked to Iyengar, who said, okay, here's your prescription for these breast cancer survivors with cancer-related fatigue. And again, the women in the health education condition, they met every week in groups and heard about various health education topics. So what did we find? Oh, let me show you first, again, let's look at the poses. So Iyengar believes that stimulation of the adrenal gland is very important for fatigue. And so they like to do back bending poses that they feel like will be important for that. So one of the unique things about Iyengar yoga is they use a lot of props. And they use props because, again, they believe in the power of these poses. So these women cannot push into a back bend and hold it for 5 minutes, right? Very few people can do that. So the beauty of the Iyengar approach is they use props to get people into positions that they believe have these therapeutic effects. So they can do something like a chest opener safely and hold that pose so it can have its supposed therapeutic benefit. So we've got back bends, upside down poses or inversions are thought to be really helpful for fatigue. So again, you can see here, these women are doing shoulder stands, but they're doing them in a supported way. So they're resting their back and feet up on a wall, so they're not having to balance and hold the pose. Instead, they can let their bodies kind of soak in the benefits of being upside down. And finally, we have restorative poses like the Supta Baddha Konasana. This is how the women began every class. They loved this pose. So what did we find? Well, we were delighted to see that the yoga intervention led to significant reductions in fatigue. So you can see that over on the left side of the graph. And the blue line, we saw a reduction in fatigue in women who had gone through this 12-week yoga intervention, that they continued to decrease at the 3-month post-treatment follow-up. In contrast, the women in the health education group, they came every week, they found it really helpful, but their fatigue did not get any better. We saw similar benefits when we looked at vigor. So fatigue is like how tired are you, how kind of exhausted do your muscles feel. Vigor is how much energy you have, and yoga also led to significant increases in vigor in this group. So again, we're also really interested in how these therapies are affecting both these behavioral states, psychological and behavioral states, but also the immune system. And so here we're looking at a molecular marker of inflammation. So not to get too into the weeds here, but we have these transcription factors that live inside our cells and are responsible for telling our genes what kind of genes to turn on, what kind of proteins to make. And one of the most important pro-inflammatory transcription factors, one of these little signalers that's telling inflammation to get kicked up inside the cell, is NF-kappa B. So that's one that we look at in a lot of our studies. We want to see, what is NF-kappa B doing from before to after yoga? Is it still super active and it's got the gas pedal on for inflammation, or is it letting off a little bit? And here we found that yoga led to decreased activity in this NF-kappa B transcription factor relative to the health education group. So this inflammation gas pedal inside the cell was pulled up a little bit in the yoga group. We also saw evidence of changes in some of the stress response systems. So we saw decreases in signaling through the sympathetic nervous system. We saw alterations in the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis and its receptor, the glucocorticoid receptor. So overall, kind of exciting data for us, and some of the first evidence showing that we could move even people with really severe and persistent problems. These women had tried lots of things for their fatigue, and this was one of the first that really helped them. Okay, so shifting gears, I'll talk about research we've done on another mind-body therapy, Tai Chi, and this is really work led by Dr. Michael Irwin here at UCLA. So Tai Chi is a traditional form of Chinese martial art. It incorporates aerobic activity, relaxation, and meditation. It's been described as meditation through movement. Of course, all of these therapies have ancient roots, which I'm totally ignoring for the purposes of this presentation. Like, I'm really just focusing on how these things are enacted in practice and what happens to the mind and body when people do them here in the West. So Dr. Irwin has been very interested in seeing whether Tai Chi is helpful for older adults with insomnia. He is an insomnia researcher and became really interested in Tai Chi. And indeed, he's got really compelling data from a number of trials, large trials, where they see that Tai Chi, which is shown here in this kind of gray line in the middle, leads to significant reductions in sleep disturbance that are pretty persistent over a long-term follow-up. And this is in a study of older adults, again, with insomnia. The other two lines here represent the other two interventions that were done in this particular study: cognitive behavioral therapy, which is considered the gold standard for insomnia treatment, and a sleep seminar, which is their control condition. They didn't expect this to do much. You can see that actually all of these conditions all of these interventions led to improvements in sleep. But Tai Chi was definitely better than sleep seminar, and again, had a great persistence across the follow-up period. So, Dr. Irwin came to UCLA and became interested in some of the work we've been doing with breast cancer survivors, many of whom experience insomnia. So he was really eager to try out this therapy for the breast cancer survivor population who are experiencing insomnia symptoms. So this was a trial where they're comparing Tai Chi to cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. Again, CBT is the gold standard, better than medication for insomnia. So here they're basically asking, is Tai Chi as good as that? Like, maybe it's better than nothing, but is it as good as cognitive behavioral therapy, which is the best you can get right now, the best we have right now? So what did they find? They saw beneficial effects for both Tai Chi and cognitive behavioral therapy in this trial. So Tai Chi is in the blue line, cognitive behavioral therapy is in the gold line. And you can see both are leading to significant decreases over the intervention period. This was a 3-month intervention that persisted for a really long time. For those of you who don't look at a lot of intervention data, sometimes we're effective at getting people better, but usually they bounce right back up to where they were before. And they're really seeing enduring effects in this trial, which is very exciting. Tai Chi also led to beneficial effects on fatigue, shown here in figure A, and depression, shown here in figure B. Again, CBT is doing the same thing. These two systems, these two interventions are both tracking each other. They're both showing improvement, which is very exciting. So what about inflammation? So this is the part where we start to see a divergence in the effects of these therapies. And what we're seeing here is that the mind-body therapy, Tai Chi, seems to be having more of an effect on inflammatory biology. The Tai Chi group is showing a decrease in a cellular measure of inflammation. This is showing how good these immune cells are at making pro-inflammatory cytokines. In this context, we want to see a decrease in this over time. We're seeing that in the Tai Chi group, which is shown in the dotted line, versus the CBT group. They're just staying constant over the period. We also see decreases in inflammatory gene expression. Here again, now we're looking inside the cell to see what's going on with these genes. Are genes for inflammation getting turned on? And that whole system is turning down in people who have gone through Tai Chi, much more so than we see in the context of cognitive behavioral therapy. So it's really interesting here because in these trials, and this is going to be the only one I'll talk a little bit about this for the next studies, but we're comparing more of a standard kind of cognitive approach, and there is behaviors that are changed in CBT, but what they're focusing on is sleep behaviors, like you're going to sleep at the same time every night, you're working on your sleep hygiene, you're not doing relaxation or other things. This mind-body approach, which really it's not like targeting how people are thinking about sleep or how they're approaching their sleep. They're really just doing this meditative movement, and that seems to be really efficacious. Okay, then the third type of therapy that I want to talk about is mindfulness meditation. So mindfulness can be defined as paying attention to present moment experiences with openness and curiosity, and importantly, without judgment. Interventions designed to cultivate mindfulness are associated with reduced depression and anxiety. There's pretty robust evidence for that. Some evidence for effects on inflammation. The effects get a little sketchier. You guys have a wonderful mindfulness center, a mindfulness research center at Brown, and we have one at UCLA as well. So we were very interested in mindfulness as an approach for younger breast cancer survivors. This is a group that we've been studying for a number of years. And these women, everyone is distressed by cancer diagnosis and treatment, but younger women are the most distressed. They have the most depression, they have the most fatigue. Cancer comes at an unexpected time for them. They're often building relationships, building their families, building their careers. Suddenly they get hit with a cancer diagnosis. And, you know, on top of all the psychological issues involved with dealing with cancer, they're frequently given treatments that put them into premature menopause. So they're also suffering from a lot of physical symptoms as well, hot flashes, et cetera. So not only are younger women at elevated risk for depression, they're also at elevated risk for recurrence and death, cancer-related death. If you get breast cancer early, it's more likely to come back. So we really wanted to find a treatment approach to help these women, both in mind and body. And for this particular group, we thought that mindfulness would be a really good fit. So we did an initial pilot study, a randomized controlled trial, or RCT, where we randomized women to either be in our mindfulness intervention or to hang out and wait, do nothing, and then they'll get the intervention after they finish participating in the trial. So that's the waitlist control group. Now, we're very fortunate at UCLA, as I mentioned, because we have the Mindful Awareness Research Center here. And that group, led by Diana Winston, has developed a 6-week mindfulness intervention called Mindful Awareness Practices, or MAPS. Diana, I should mention, is also a Brown grad. She graduated my year, although we did not know each other. So we met back here at UCLA, and it's been fun to work together. So MAPS includes presentation of theoretical materials on mindfulness, relaxation, and the mind-body connection, as well as experiential practice of meditation. So they do sitting meditations, walking meditation, loving kindness meditation, a lot of formal meditation practices. But one of the really unique things about the MAPS program is they really focus on mindfulness in daily life. So it's not all about kind of sitting and actually having a 5 to 20 to 30 minute period where you're doing a focused meditation exercise. They also do a lot of instruction about, you know, you're walking through your day and you notice that you're about to get upset, and how do you bring mindfulness to that moment? Or potentially, and this will come out a little later in the talk, you're walking through your day and you notice a beautiful sunset. You stop. You enjoy that in a different way than perhaps you might have. So a lot of this daily life experience. So we did this initial study, and again, we were excited to see beneficial effects of the mindfulness intervention. The mindfulness group, or MAPS group, is in the blue line, and you can see that the women in that group showed significant decreases in depressive symptoms. Actually, these were marginally significant. That's what the little cross means. Whereas the control condition showed no change. We also found significant decreases in perceived stress in the mindfulness group, and the control group just stayed constant. So the mindfulness seems to be helping women reduce depressive symptoms and reduce perceived stress. We also saw effects on some of these other symptoms I mentioned. So the women in the MAPS group, they got less fatigued and their sleep improved. Actually, they reported fewer problems with sleep at the end of the intervention. So what about effects on inflammatory biology? Again, here we're seeing a decrease in expression of pro-inflammatory genes in the mindfulness group. So again, these genes that are responsible for making pro-inflammatory cytokines, that's getting turned down in the women who've gone through the mindfulness intervention, as well as this kind of upstream transcription factor, this little, agent that's putting the gas on these pro-inflammatory genes, that's pulling up in the mindfulness group relative to the waitlist control group. So here again, we're seeing evidence for both effects on the mind and on the body. So we are very excited because we just recently completed data collection and published our initial data from a much larger trial. So this first trial was a little study we did at UCLA. I think we had like 70 women. Based on those promising preliminary data, we then conducted a large multi-site trial. So this is with our collaborators at Dana-Farber and at Johns Hopkins. We enrolled 247 women that were these young women. They all had elevated depression at baseline. And in this study, we put them into mindfulness meditation or a health education condition called survivorship education, or again, a waitlist control. And they completed assessments pre and post treatment and over a 6-month follow-up. So I'm just going to be focusing on the mindfulness group for sake of simplicity here and compared to the waitlist control. So here we're seeing actually really dramatic effects for the mindfulness intervention. The women are starting the study in the clinical range on this particular inventory, indicating that they have clinically significant depressive symptoms, and they show significant declines over the 6-week intervention. We're still seeing the benefits of it 6 months later compared to the waitlist control condition. Excuse me. We also saw significant decreases in fatigue and in insomnia in the women who had mindfulness, again, shown here in the blue line. We're seeing decreases from pre to post intervention, and those decreases persist over the follow-up. Similar thing for insomnia. We see beneficial effects, they persist over the follow-up period. So if I was going to follow the same sequence I have been doing, I would show you the inflammation data now. Those are still under wraps. It looks like we have some promising effects, but we have not unveiled those yet. So those are coming. And instead, what I want to shift attention to is the next question that we're really trying to grapple with in our research is, so how is this happening? Like, what's going on here? So what I've been focusing on for you so far is the idea that we're decreasing stress. So I've shown you data over and over. We're decreasing depression, we're decreasing stress, we're improving fatigue, sleep, etc. So maybe it's this reduction in stress that seems to be leading to some of these mind-body effects, including effects on the immune system. But again, it's also possible that these interventions may be moving positive psychology, increasing well-being, meaning and purpose, etc. So I'm going to show you some data to suggest that that pathway may actually be really important. So let's go back to data from that first little study that I showed you, where we're looking at mindfulness meditation for younger breast cancer survivors. I showed you that we had decreases in stress. We also found significant increases in positive psychological states. So this included feelings of happiness, but it also included things like self-kindness. Now, the only reason we included self-kindness is not a construct that I typically include in my studies. We were very interested in it though, because of the mindfulness instructor. And she said, I think that one of the things this practice teaches, both explicitly and implicitly, is for people to be nicer to themselves, basically, because a lot of what's modeled in this practice is sitting with negative emotions and being okay with that, not judging yourself for those negative emotions, and also not judging yourself for how hard it is to sit with those negative emotions. So that's explicitly taught. You do loving kindness meditation, you send that loving kindness to yourself, which is pretty challenging for many people. But it's also modeled throughout the practice. You're learning to accept feelings in an accepting way, in a kind way. And self-kindness turned out to be really interesting here because it actually was the driver of the effects on depression. So there's lots of reasons why mindfulness could influence depression. But in this particular study, it looked like part of the reason was because it made people nicer to themselves, and that improved their mood. It reduced their depressive symptoms. We also looked at some negative emotion regulation pathways, and those were important too, but self-kindness was really the winner in terms of drivers of changes in depression in our initial trial. Okay, so the final study I'll talk with you about is one that was really designed to probe these questions about what is driving these effects, and in particular, what's driving the effects that we see on the immune system. So this was a teeny little study. We had 22 women. Again, these were younger breast cancer survivors. And the difference in this, two differences in this trial, we didn't have a control group. And we were really interested in what was going on in the brain as well as the body during and after mindfulness meditation. So in addition to completing questionnaires and doing blood draws, as we do in all of our studies, the women underwent neuroimaging. So and I'll show you a little bit about the tasks that we did before and after the intervention. Okay, so what did we find in this trial? Let's start with what we found in terms of just our self-report psychological symptoms. Just as we've seen in our previous studies, mindfulness was effective in reducing depression in these women. It was also effective, a little less so, in reducing perceived stress. It was also good at increasing positive psychological states. So we found a significant increase in self-kindness and a significant increase in eudaimonic well-being. Eudaimonic well-being is an interesting construct. It includes a variety of different kind of positive psychological processes, like feeling like you have a meaning and feeling of sense of meaning and purpose in life, feeling like you have a close social network, feeling like you have opportunities in your life for personal growth. So in some traditions in well-being, they talk about hedonic well-being, which is kind of happiness and pleasure. And they contrast that with eudaimonic well-being, which again has more to do with meaning and purpose in life. And interestingly, that seemed to be influenced by this intervention. People were reporting a stronger sense of meaning and purpose in life, even though that's really not something that's explicitly talked about in the intervention. We also found changes in the immune system, even in this really small study. Just like we've seen before, we saw a decrease in the expression of these inflammation-related genes and this transcription factor, the gas pedal for these genes, and of kappa B. And then here was our first test where we were like, okay, what is driving this? Is it the decrease in stress? Or is it the increase in well-being? What seems to be correlated with these biological processes? And interestingly, depression, stress, those had nothing to do with the changes in immunity that we saw here. Instead, it was the increases in eudaimonic well-being. So the women who were reporting more of a feeling of meaning, peace, growth, etc., they were the ones that showed these beneficial changes in inflammation in this particular trial. So we also looked at this at the neural level. Okay, so let's talk about these. What do we do to these poor women when we stick them in the scanner? So we were really interested in threat-related activity, which is of course related to our stress and our stress-related physiological systems. And so we did a task that reliably elicits activity in the amygdala. So you've all heard of the amygdala, this threat response structure in the brain, and a way. So how do you get the amygdala to get activated? You show people pictures of angry and threatening faces. Or actually, here we're doing angry and fearful faces. So if you are sitting in the scanner and you're seeing these angry faces or fearful faces, it is a very reliable way to get your amygdala going, pre-programmed amygdala responses. So we were also interested in activity in reward-related regions in the brain. So here's the positive side, right? Lots of ways you can get these reward-related regions going. You can give people chocolate. you can give people money. That's a really reliable way to elicit activity in the ventral striatum and other reward-related regions. But we didn't think that was the best way to look at mindfulness effects. And instead, what we did is we showed people pictures, like positive pictures. And these also elicit activity in reward-related regions. So we were interested in, again, this kind of gets to this idea that maybe one of the things mindfulness does is it allows you to take the time to look at these pictures and maybe get more pleasure from them, which is a really kind of a cool way to be using the neuroimaging, because we can see to what extent are these pictures perceived by the brain as rewarding. So what did we find? There were decreases in amygdala activation to the threat task from pre to post intervention. This is significant for the right amygdala, but what you see is here's amygdala when you see the amygdala activity at baseline in the blue bars, and here's amygdala activity after the intervention in the gray bars. And again, we're separating here the left and right amygdala. So you can see the amygdala, it's seen these pictures before, it's not finding them as scary or threatening the second time. We also saw changes in reward-related neural activity. So here I'm showing you activity in the ventral striatum in response to the positive pictures. So here's what we see at baseline, and there's a significant increase from pre to post intervention. So it seems like the brain is getting a little more pleasure. It's, I mean, really going to be, the neuroscientists in the audience would kill me, but you're getting more activity in this reward center of the brain when looking at these pictures after the intervention. So which of these so now we're doing our test again. Which seems to be related to the immune system? Is it the decrease in amygdala activity, this turning down of the threat system, or is it the increase in reward-related activity? All the action is in reward. The people who showed more reward-related neural activity showed lower levels of inflammation. And in this particular analysis, we're looking at levels of a particular inflammatory marker, IL-6. But what you see is a really strong association between activity in that reward-related neural region, and particularly an increase in activity from pre to post intervention and a decrease in IL-6. So here again, we're finding that it's these positive psychological processes that seem to be really attuned to the immune system. Okay. So, and just now I will finish by saying that, I think across a series of studies, we've found that mind-body interventions are effective in reducing cancer-related symptoms and inflammation in cancer survivors. So we're really excited about the potential for these approaches to improve quality of life and perhaps risk of comorbidities, perhaps risk of cancer recurrence. And I'm particularly excited about this idea that it's these positive psychological states that may be the drivers here. This really runs in, against kind of accepted wisdom about what are the drivers of inflammatory biology. The idea that it's positive psychological states and reward that are important is a pretty new idea. So we're excited about that, and excited about the potential for these interventions to be moving those positive processes. And then I want to just finish by saying that, I've shown you all this data in cancer survivors, but I don't think these mind-body therapies are only effective for that group. That group is I think is an at-risk one, and is really interesting to be testing some of these therapies for. It's a population that has a lot of appetite for mind-body approaches, so really interested in being in trials. These women want to make their bodies cancer-free, and we're trying to help them with that by offering these approaches. But we've seen similar beneficial effects in a variety of other populations. So I just want to end by acknowledging all of the many fabulous collaborators. I'm focusing here on the folks at UCLA who've been working with me on this research, as well as our funding agencies, particularly the National Cancer Institute and the Breast Cancer Research Foundation, which has been an amazing supporter of our work on mindfulness. And I think I finished a little early, which is great, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Hi. So I just joined the call and caught the tail end of your presentation, but it was really wonderful. And I live in LA, and would be very, very interested in working with that section of the hospital. But I have a question. So I've been reading this book. It's called The Body Keeps the Score. I don't know. Yes. Oh, it's so fantastic. And I've been looking for more books that are kind of like this. And what you were talking about totally very much rings, very much resonates with me. And
Yeah.
Yes. And this book was really enlightening and kind of oh my goodness, my words. It's shopping period. It's crazy. I've gotten no sleep. But anyways, was wondering if you have any books that are kind of in the same wavelength.
Yeah, it's funny. I haven't actually read that book yet. My husband is a huge Ezra Klein fan, so he heard him interviewed about Ezra Klein and was then raving to me about it. It's interesting. He says the body keeps the score, but he's actually focusing on I think a lot of he's focusing a lot on the brain and the way that the brain is impacted, right, by early childhood experiences and adversity. Um, Now, I will say, we're very interested in how early life stress and trauma gets embedded in the brain and in the immune system and in how those systems communicate with each other. There's some amazing preclinical data, so data from animal studies that have shown these effects. I mean, they're kind of terrifying because it suggests that you have these early experiences and it alters the way your brain is structured and the way the brain functions. It alters your immune system in ways that we still see in adults. But I think one of the things that's really exciting about the mind-body therapies, which of course I know this investigator is also really interested in, is I think it has the ability to, I mean, it's kind of crazy to say, but it seems to be reprogramming, at least that we're looking at the cells in the immune system to see whether they get, they seem to be altered after doing these therapies. And we also think, and this one is totally speculative, I have no idea if this is true yet, but I also think it alters how the systems are communicating with each other. And I think to some extent, it may make the brain a little less sensitive to inflammatory signaling in a good way, So yeah, but I have no other books to recommend for you, except for the books written by Diana Winston on mindfulness. So she's got two that are really good.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Is it Srinivas? Am I saying your name correctly?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your talk. I had a question that was maybe you haven't explored, or maybe you have, I'm not sure. But I'm just curious whether people or your lab have done studies on comparing, let's say, like the three kinds of things you had mentioned, yoga, was it Tai Chi or Qigong, I'm not sure,
Yeah.
and mindfulness. And clearly all of them seem to be reducing stress or creating positive psychological states. But have people done comparisons on whether or not those things are all kind of functioning in similar ways to achieve these similar ends?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I see Dr. Jane is on the call. Lovely to see your face, so you can comment on this as well. I personally, I'm like trying to stay out of the business of comparing these treatments to each other because I feel like we're still in a space where we want to show that they're effective. And I almost don't want to start, and that's not what you're suggesting, because I think what you're suggesting is, are they working in similar ways? Which is a really, I think, interesting and important question. I'm emphasizing here the similarities among these approaches, but you also, you can see that we picked a different approach for the different problems that people were experiencing. So whether like would mindfulness be my first pick for people with severe fatigue? Probably not. I think yoga is better for them because I think that kind of problem may benefit from something that perhaps is a little more body focused. So, I think that these approaches may be beneficial for different conditions. And it's possible that they may work through different mechanisms. I mean, in some ways it would be weird if they didn't. We may not be at the state yet where we're good enough to be able to determine what those differences are. We may not have as a fine-tuned, for example, picture of the immune system to be able to see, ooh, this one is doing this one is doing this. I think it's a super interesting question. And where I've gone with it a little bit is, what is the particular condition that these treatments might be most helpful for? But then the other, I think, really important question is, which is kind of related, but like, who's gonna do best in mindfulness versus yoga? And that we know very little about, or who's gonna do best in yoga versus cognitive behavioral therapy, right? Like these things work better for some people. They work better for some symptoms than others, and they probably work better for some people than others. So that's something we're also really interested in understanding.
Yeah. exactly. I mean, I could ask a lot more questions, but maybe we can go to other questions
Okay.
before I bombard you with lots of things. But yes, I hear what you're saying, and I think it's probably a good idea that, like you said, it's, you know, you're not gonna delve into that complex world of things. So I appreciate.
Yeah, it's again, it's the, I think especially I feel like it's been really important for people who are not kind of deeply invested in these approaches, like me, like you know, yoga, let's see if it works. I can just apply the same science that I would do to anything else I'm investigating. But I think that's been really important for establishing the validity of these treatments and the rigor of these treatments. And so I think especially initially, we didn't want to be comparing them against each other as if to say like, oh, we only have to figure out which one of these that we can put all our money into, basically, right? So we were trying not to do that. Yeah. Daniel.
You.
Thank you so much for the talk. It was very interesting. I was just wondering, you were talking just now about, say, who's going to do well in yoga as opposed to who might do well in CBT, as opposed to who might do well in something else. I'm wondering if there's any evidence of whether the effects of some of these different treatments are additive, or whether that's something you're looking at, or you know, is there kind of a plateau, or how does that look?
It's a great question, and there are intervention designs that are well situated, that are poised to address exactly that kind of question. It's like, okay, you failed on this, what are we going to do next? And they can do that in a systematic way. I haven't seen those done with these mind-body therapies. And again, you know, Dr. Jane, maybe you have, you can, you know, there's very sophisticated designs that are being used in kind of cognitive behavioral therapy to figure out those kind of questions, but I haven't seen them here. The one thing we thought a little bit about was combining exercise and meditation, because there's, you know, like both of these are good. Can we put them together? And we did not get success with getting funding to do that particular trial. And I think it's an interesting question. It's probably better if they're sequential, I think, than perhaps done together. Because I think learning any new thing is hard, and to then be doing two of them, maybe that's good. Maybe that reinforces like mindful exercise or something like that. You get a 2-for-1, but I think in some ways it's probably better to have them be sequential.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that makes sense.
Alana?
Yeah, hi. Thank you for your presentation. I have 2 questions. You said that you thought mindfulness practices were a good fit for younger women with cancer, and I was wondering what your initial thinking was for that choice. And then I'm also wondering if there were psychological requirements or screenings to participate, patients to participate in the studies, and how you made those decisions.
Yeah, so great questions. So we started this program of research because, in part, because we got funding from a father of a young breast cancer survivor who was like, figure out what I can do to make sure my daughter lives for a long time. And so we really had this focus on like, what drives recurrence in women with breast cancer? Exercise, we know, is a predictor of doing well versus poorly. And also, you know, inflammation is a predictor of recurrence and survival. So we thought about doing an exercise intervention, and we had a focus group with young women, and maybe because we live in LA, they did not want an exercise intervention. They're like, we exercise all the time, we're totally fit, that's not what we need, we are really stressed. So I think for us, it was informed by a desire to really be trying to hit this long-term outcome for these women, but also responding to their self-report and what we know from the broader literature about the psychological challenges that these women are experiencing. Again, they have higher levels of stress, higher levels of depression, more fear of recurrence, more anxiety. And again, for that particular constellation of symptoms, meditation is a little bit more of a kind of direct stress reduction, right? So we thought we might be giving those women more skills that were directly targeting the depressed mood and the perceived stress component. So to answer your second question, in our initial study, we did not, our only requirements were that you had to have been diagnosed with premenopausal breast cancer. And it just turned out that those women, as we know, are depressed. So we had high levels of depressive symptoms. In our second trial, we had depressive symptoms as an entry criteria, pretty low level, but you had to have a few symptoms. And the idea there is, if you're just doing beautifully and perfectly happy and you just want to be in a trial, we're not going to be able to make you any better because you're not having any symptoms to begin with. So that was an entry criteria for that trial. I should say one of the things we're really excited about is we're developing, like everyone else in the world, a digital version of our intervention. And we're hoping to launch that and test that in a nationwide sample of breast cancer survivors. So you guys, may or not know, there's a clinical trials network where they test cancer drugs, and that's how they test and see if these drugs work. There is no such thing for behavioral interventions. That's why all of us who do behavioral interventions, we do it in our little site or with our friends at other institutions. But if we get access to this clinical trials network, we get community oncologists from across the country who get paid to put patients on trial. So I guess I'm really excited about the idea that if we have a therapy that seems to be effective for these women who really are in need, that maybe we'll be able to test to see if that's working in this much broader population. Catherine.
Thank you for your talk. I had a question about the mindfulness meditation data showing that it increased reward-related activity. I was wondering about that in the context of what one thinks of the traditional purposes of meditation, which is to increase detachment, and how that fit together with an increase in reward-related activity.
Yeah, it's funny that you're talking about this because we're currently designing our new neuroimaging study, and this is exactly what comes up, right? And it all depends, I think, on what task you're having them do in the scanner. So are you having them do, there's a lot of tasks that are great tasks for looking at reward-related activity, and they all involve playing a game for money. And it's just so not what is going on in mindfulness. I'm tempted to do these tasks only to show that we actually get reductions in reward-related activity in response to winning money. So we're really trying to get a task in the scanner that's capturing something that is taught in mindfulness, which maybe not taught, but maybe experienced, which is an enhanced appreciation of positive psychological experiences, even though you're not explicitly trying to turn those up. So in talking with the mindfulness instructor, the way she formulates it is, if you can get rid of kind of your typical habitual patterns of thought and negative appraisals and allow yourself to be in a more open and accepting state, maybe a side effect of that is that you increase your positive emotion, even though, again, that's not an explicit goal. So that's really what we're trying to figure out is, and there's actually, there's a really interesting debate in the mindfulness literature, which you may be aware of, where there's a camp of people that think mindfulness changes how you view the world and it increases your ability to enjoy positive experiences. And there's another group of people who are like, that is not what mindfulness does. That's not what it's intended to do at all. So we're trying to stay close to, being informed by our mindfulness instructor and her 20 years of experience, and trying again to get at tasks that we think get a little bit close to what the experience of the people in the class might be.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hal.
Julie, thank you for this wonderful talk, which I find fascinating and doubly rewarding because I first talked to Diana when her roommates were students of mine back in the winter of 87, 88.
Yep.
And also, back when I was in university, so half a century ago, the only A+ paper I ever wrote was on Hans Selye's pioneering work on psychological stress as one of the important factors in the etiology of various diseases. And I focused on late onset diabetes, and did some original research in the Albany Medical Center where I grew up, where I administered a questionnaire which I developed to diabetes patients. Anyway, there was some networking that I had to do then. But that led me to be ushered into some experiments in stimulating mouse brains, which drove me completely away from the field. And in those days, it's so rewarding to see how far the field has come. And your research is a good example of how much progress we've made in those 50 years. So it's gone from the idea that psychological stress is an important factor in the etiology of all kinds of different diseases, went from complete nonsense. I mean, I can't tell you how many people laughed at me who were part of the medical world and said, "Oh yeah, like it's all in your brain, right? It's all in your mind." And so it's very rewarding to see. I wanted to ask you about the eudaimonic side of things, because that's where the work that I do in teaching in contemplative studies, I see it plugging in these days. And so the little bit that I know about this is that some of the work on eudaimonic well-being was originally done by Ryan and Desi, and that they developed a questionnaire about that. So I wonder if that's what you're using. And then I also wanted to ask you if you were aware of the research that Eric Garland is doing at University of Utah on non-dual awareness. And he's developed a mindfulness technique that opens up patients or participants' awareness of the non-duality that's inherent in everyday experience. And the extent, and he's using it for opioid addiction. But I think it could very beneficially be applied to some of the areas of research that you're working on.
Yeah, well, great. Thank you so much for that question. And yeah, if you heard the intro to my talk, one of the things that I like to brag about is that I have this inaugural chair, which probably doesn't mean very much to most people, but it's this George Solomon chair. And George Solomon was a huge pioneer.
Congratulations, Julie. That's awesome.
He, hung a banner, laboratory of psychoimmunology at Stanford, how many years ago? And it was totally revolutionary. Everybody thought he was completely crazy, right? And my little story about that is I was once had the opportunity to sit next to Tony Fauci at a RAND board dinner. And I'm just a little graduate student, and he's like, "Oh, little graduate student, what do you study?" I'm like, "Oh, psychoneuroimmunology." He's like the AIDS czar. And he just looked at me like, psychology and the immune system? Crazy, and where we are now with understanding how the brain and the immune system are like working in lockstep together is really exciting. So to your question about eudaimonic well-being, we do not use Ryan and Desi's scale. They have this beautiful work, self-determination theory. We use Carol Riff's scale, which is, again, part of this tradition of looking at eudaimonic well-being. It has subscales that have to do with kind of personal eudaimonic well-being, how much you're experiencing meaning and purpose in life, feel opportunities for growth. And it also has really interesting social subscales. So some of them are just feeling like you have social connections, really strong overlap with social support. But there's a really interesting part of her scales that it's actually one of her students, who I'm blanking on his name. But he is very interested in this at more of a societal level. So one of the things measured by this scale is Corey Keyes, that's his name. is to what extent do you feel a part of your community? Do you feel like you're making a difference in your community? Are you, you know, are you part of something bigger than yourself, not just your immediate social relationships, but this broader world? And the scale has some really interesting questions on it that I find challenging to administer and interpret in these times, because it has things like, do you understand the way life works, or your community functions? Does society make sense to you? Which is like increasingly a challenging question to ask, but I think super interesting. And so that's one of the things we really like about that scale. And it's interesting to see which of those components seems to trend more strongly with biology. In many studies, it's the social component, and it kind of it's part of, again, there's a growing interest in how pro-social processes, not just receiving support, but giving support, participating in your community, helping others, can have powerful effects on health. So it's interesting that that's kind of packaged into this eudaimonic well-being scale.
And I wonder too on how the same tests that you're giving here in North America would be received and responded to, for example, in East Asian cultures and societies, in which I find that there's a much stronger, what I would call communitarian ethos, as opposed to an individualist ethos over here.
So one of my colleagues, Steve Cole, he does all of our gene expression biology, both for our group and for many people. And so he has collaborators around the world, and they've published data looking at eudaimonic well-being, for example, in Japan, and how that's related to inflammatory biology. So you might look at his work again, Steve Cole.
Cole, C-O-L-E?
C-O-L-E, yeah. You can look up eudaimonic well-being, inflammation, you'll get 10 publications, something like that coming for him.
Amazing what's available these days.
Yeah, I know. There was a question I thought from Gilbert. Yes, your hand is up. Is that still active? Yeah, hi.
Yes, hello. I became interested in your comment about reward motivation.
Yeah.
Because as you said, the practice of meditation also produces experiences that are themselves immensely pleasurable, the positive psychological experience. Like, even though in the context of your study, these are people who have depressive symptoms, but still, like, do you think, I wonder to what extent the pursuit of those positive psychological states becomes itself the reward, or if not, what begins to motivate them if it isn't like the pecuniary reward from your test?
I think I understand what you're saying. Like, it's almost like with exercise, like when does exercise become rewarding, and does that facilitate your ability to continue it? So I think in this study, my graduate students have convinced me that we're going to try to have people meditate in the scanner. So we can actually look to see if we're seeing activation of these reward-related neural regions. For example, I think they're going to be doing, I think we're doing that, having them do compassion meditation. So what happens when you're directing compassion towards someone else? What happens when you're directing compassion towards yourself? And I have no idea if that's going to activate reward-related regions, or this region in particular, the ventral striatum. But you're asking, I think, a super interesting question, which honestly goes a little beyond my pay grade. It goes a little bit to Hal's part of his question that I'm realizing I didn't answer, which is about Eric Garland. And this, people are really thinking deeply about the neuroscience of meditation and these kind of different states that it puts you in. And those things are really interesting to model in the scanner. I'm a little closer to kind of, okay, how do those things then influence our downstream biology? So that's been the place I've accessed it. Stephanie, I see your hand up.
Yes, so thank you again for that amazing talk. Really, really interesting research. I have a number of questions, but the first one is a practical question, and I'd like to understand better, when you collect these samples for looking at the inflammation markers, is there a standardized way to do that? Like, is it always, a week after they've done their last class or during, or, we worry about it's winter, it's spring, it's cold season. And so how do you deal with that variability to get some really significant results?
It's a great question, and a couple of thoughts about it. So we usually we never do it right after the last class, but we try to do it within a week of the last class. And sometimes that turns out to be 2 weeks of the last class. Just if we're doing a big trial, it's hard to get everybody in to do all those blood draws. It depends on what measure of the immune system you're looking at, how reliable these effects are. So we see much more reliable effects when we're looking at molecular markers of inflammation. So another way you can look at inflammation is you can look at the proteins, these cytokines that these immune cells are producing. That's a much messier marker. It's influenced by time of day. It's influenced by whether you were in a hurry and ran up the stairs to the lab, for example. And also those cytokines are secreted by a lot of other cells in the body, including fat cells. So BMI can be a big contributor to differences in them. So we tend to find more reliable effects with these genomic markers, in contrast to they're just noisier. The circulating markers are noisier.
And is there something specific you have to do with the sample in order to be able to look at genomic markers?
Yeah, so initially, RNA is pretty stable. You can draw it into a particular type of blood tube and stick it in the freezer, and then they have to be frozen, right? They can't sit around forever. There are, again, has more to do with the circulating inflammatory markers, but I review papers that their data is not in kind of physiological range. And when I read what they did with their samples, they left them out on the bench overnight. And, you can't do that. So that's one approach if you're actually doing venipuncture. Increasingly, we're trying to use dried blood spots because it's much easier, especially as we've now been not able to have in-person visits. And you can get RNA from dried blood spots, and those are super easy to collect. And there are companies just making them easier and easier. And then you just have a little card that you stick in the freezer. So it's not as fussy as you might think. The more you're trying to do with the sample, like we have some studies where we're trying to look at individual cells and what's going on inside of particular cells, then that requires a different kind of processing.
Okay, thank you. The other question I'm dying to ask you is, did you look at things that are common with these techniques, like changes in the breath, changes in the heart rate variability, and how in the autonomic system that relates to immune function? Or what do we know about the relation between that and immune function?
Yeah, such a great question. I think I had colleagues who spent like 2 years trying to look at the effects of meditation on the parasympathetic nervous system, and they were not seeing what they thought they would see, which was, increases in parasympathetic nervous system activity. Yeah. Again, those are fussy systems. They're high effort to assess them reliably. So we haven't really gone there. With the yoga study, I think we looked at heart rate, blood pressure, that kind of thing. But those, they're not great measures. They're so variable. It really depends on the state of the person as you're assessing them. So that hasn't
we're finding that too, actually.
Yeah. I mean, but I will tell you, so one of the nice things about doing these immune markers is we can look to see how these other systems are signaling to the immune cells. So for example, we can look at CREB, which is one of the big mediators of the sympathetic nervous system, right? So if you see changes in that transcription factor, that can give you a clue that the sympathetic nervous system is also changing. But we haven't chased activity in those systems, and it's a really interesting and important question.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah. Any other questions? Doesn't look like it.
Julie, I have a question, but I'm not
Yeah.
sure if I have a great connection to ask. But beautiful talk. Thank you so much. I work in the domain of rheumatology, and
Okay.
as you know, it's all inflammation damage, and IL-6 is our everyday language.
Yep.
And any interest in studying this population because the fatigue is such a tremendous difficult problem to treat. We give them immunosuppression and patients complain of fatigue, and that's very difficult.
Yeah, I don't work with that patient population at all. Fatigue is such a huge problem across a number of conditions. Honestly, I think that long COVID is going to direct a lot of energy toward understanding the immune contributors to fatigue. So it's like how HIV basically invigorated our understanding of viruses and how they work. And we learned so much about viral immunity. So we'll see if long COVID is going to do that same thing in ways that are translatable to other diseases. I mean, some, of course, there's disease specificity, but inflammation does seem to be consistent across. But yeah, no, I don't work in that population at all.
How beautiful research. And I would love to see your slides if you guys don't mind sharing at some point.
I think they record the talk, right? Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Good. Larson, do you want to close us out, or should I?
Certainly, if there are no other questions, then I'd like to just say again, for everyone, thank you so much, Dr. Bauer, for this fantastic presentation. I think we all learned a lot tonight. This lecture has been recorded and will be put up on our website at some point in the future. And keep an eye out for the announcement for our next lecture in the series, sometime toward the end of next month. So to all of you, stay well, and see you next time.
Great.
And if
Thanks,
people want to
everyone,
hold
so
on
much.
for a second, I'll put the website in the chat so you can find it easily, the links to the talks.